Mr. Chair, members, good afternoon. We're going to be working from the documents. It's the Article 2 side-by-side. You can tell which one it is. At the bottom, it says page R1-Art 2. And at the top of this document on the left-hand side, you'll see the Senate language from the third engrossment of the bill. On the right-hand side, you'll see the House language from the second unofficial engrossment of the bill. And one thing I should note initially, normally the way this would work is Ms. Taylor and I would go back and forth as dictated by the changes, what changes were made to which statutes. But this year, because there were so many changes, so many differences, the reviser thought it made a little more sense to set out the Senate language separately from the House language, except where the provisions are more or less identical. And after conferring with Ms. Taylor, we decided that that might make it easier for us to do this walkthrough, so that's what we're going to do. I'll go through most of the Senate language, and then Ms. Taylor will go through most of the House language. And we're just going to touch on these at a fairly high level to begin with, and then we can answer any questions that the conferees have.
Mr. Stanley, I want to make sure everybody has a copy. Does everybody have a copy of that and ready to go? Okay, sounds good.
All right. So beginning with Section 1 on the Senate side, this is a DNR policy item that just changes the month that the permitting efficiency report from DNR is due. Turning to page R2, Section 2 would prohibit the DNR from enforcing unadopted rules. Section 3 allows a current owner of an off-highway motorcycle to transfer ownership of that vehicle. This is one of several provisions that just changes. Right now, a registered owner can transfer ownership. This would change that to a current owner to acknowledge that sometimes the current owner isn't a registered owner. You'll see a couple more of those up ahead here. At the bottom of R2 is Section 4. This is the first of several DNR provisions that modernize the snowmobile registration decal regime. Section 4 is one of those, and I'm not going to go into that in great detail. They're all part of these DNR policy changes. Section 5 on page R3 is another, as is Section 6. Turning to R4, Section 8 is also a DNR snowmobile change. And then scooting back to Section 7, this is another one of those that allows current owners, not just registered owners, to transfer ownership, in this case of snowmobiles. Skipping ahead to page R5, Section 9. Actually, the change here is on the following page on R6. This would allow road authorities to designate places where snowmobiles can cross divided highways. On page R7, Section 10 modifies the definition of ATVs. Section 11 authorizes current owners of ATVs to transfer them. This is the third of those three provisions I just mentioned. And then at the bottom of R7 is the first same provision. This is Senate Section 12 and House Section 10. This just modifies the loose line trail to include a connection to the Greenleaf Lake State Recreation Area. Again, that's a same between the Senate and the House. On the next page, this is page R8, Section 13 on the Senate side is a DNR policy provision that would allow DNR to set reservation policies for its facilities and programs. The bottom of that page, Senate Section 14 and House Section 20. These are identical. This would require payment for timber cut from state lands to be postmarked within 30 days rather than paid within 30 days. That's a DNR policy provision. On page R9, Senate Section 15, this sets timelines for completing environmental review and permitting of metallic mineral mining projects, and where those deadlines cannot be adhered to, it requires legislative notification of that fact. On page...
Is that also DNR?
No.
No. Okay.
On page R10 is Senate Section 16 that modifies the definition of a minnow to include suckers of all sizes. Section 17 on the Senate side and 22 on the House side are identical. These just modernize the definition of unloaded. This has been floating around for a few years now. Section 18 on the Senate side at the bottom of that page is different from Section 23 on the House side. What these sections do is expand the walk-in access program so that it's not just for hunting, but it also includes other purposes like bird watching, nature photography, and that sort of thing. The difference you can see on page R11 on lines 24.26 of the Senate side and 24.27. The way the statute currently reads is that in order to have a motorized vehicle on these lands, a person with disability also has to have a license to shoot from a stationary vehicle. The Senate language changes this in keeping with the rest of the changes in the section so that motorized use just has to be for cases where there is, the person has a disability. The House language did not make this change, and so in order to have motorized vehicles as part of the walk-in access program, a person would still have to have this, this license to shoot from a stationary vehicle under the House language. On the bottom of that page, page R11, Senate Section 19 and House Section 24 are the same. This modernizes the statute that allows, that authorizes DNR to allow persons with disabilities to use motor vehicles and WMAs. Turning to the next page, Senate, and that's page R12. Senate Section 20 is a DNR policy bill provision that's been floating around for a few years that repeals a sunset of authority to leave deer stands in certain WMAs overnight. Section 21 at the bottom of R12 is another DNR policy section that allows a person to establish residency for game and fish purposes with an application for a driver's license or with tribal identification. Section 22 on the Senate side and Section 26 on the House side modernizes the statute that governs which firearms can be used to take big game and wolves. That's from the DNR policy bill. At the bottom of R13 is a Senate-only Section 23. This would require that ground blinds display blaze orange or pink during deer firearm season. At the bottom of R14 is Section 24, which prohibits new antler point restrictions. On R15, Section 25 would shrink the shotgun zone so that it encompasses only Dodge and Olmsted counties. Section 26 at the bottom of that page requires DNR to issue permits to relocate nuisance bears. Section 27 on R16 would allow scaring, chasing, et cetera, of deer and elk causing damage to agricultural crops. That's from DNR policy bill. The bottom of that page, Section 28, repeals the minnow importation ban. On R17 is Section 29, which allows two-line fishing on stretches of the Minnesota and Mississippi rivers. That's from the DNR policy bill. Section 30 on R17 authorizes importation of minnows under a permit issued by the DNR and subject to various health requirements. On R18 is Section 31, which prohibits revision of the public waters inventory from taking effect where a political subdivision objects. On R19, Section 32 is the first of several sections clarifying that the statutes at issue in the recent White Bear Lake decision do not prohibit the issuance of certain water appropriations permits. That's a mouthful of a sentence. On the next page, R20, Section 33 requires DNR to provide an analysis of the basis for denials of water appropriations permits where the denial is based on the impact to a calcareous fen. It also provides for review of that decision as well as contested case hearing in certain cases. Moving on to R21, Section 34 allows appropriation of up to 4 million gallons a year from the Mount Simon Hinckley Aquifer for the purpose of growing trees, to facilitate the growth of trees. Section 35 prohibits DNR from modifying water use permits when those permits are transferred as part of the underlying real estate transfer. Section 36 provides that DNR must assess land value impacts before preparing groundwater management plans. Section 37 is another White Bear Lake provision. On R22 now, Section 38 limits the type of information that can be disseminated about the development of groundwater management plans, and again provides that land value impacts have to be part of that assessment. Section 39 on R23 on the Senate side and House Section 42 are different. They both define what sustainable is for purposes of issuing water appropriations permits for groundwater. The Senate language would say that it's sustainable where it will result in a less than 20% change from the median August stream flow. The House language would say it's sustainable where the recharge to the aquifer is sufficient to replenish the groundwater in the aquifer. So that's a case where there's a difference between the two. Moving on to Senate Section 40 on that same page, this is another White Bear Lake provision, as is Section 41. Section 42 on R24 requires the well condition to be taken into account when validating a well interference claim. Section 43 on that same page, well, it begins on that page, is the first of several provisions that clarify that PCA's water fee setting and increase authority is subject to legislative approval. That section goes all the way to R28, and on R28 is Section 44, which extends to industrial wastewater permittees the same regulatory certainty that the legislature gave to municipal wastewater permittees a few years ago. Section 45 provides that SSTS tanks that have drainage holes drilled into them that have been repaired meet minimum standards for SSTS tanks. Section 46 is another PCA fee provision, as are sections 47 and 48 on R29. And then sections 49 through 53 concern the regulatory treatment of chemical plastics recycling. Those provisions begin on R29 and go through R31. And they just make clear that for chemical plastic recycling, the way that the statutes that would otherwise apply to that process and related facilities. Section 54 on R31 and on the Senate side, and Section 55 on the House side on R31 are identical. This just modifies the frequency with which DNR has to submit its 3M reporting. Section 55 at the bottom of R31 carries over to R32, and this modifies PCA's permitting efficiency report in several ways. That provision carries through to R34, where you have Section 56, which is another PCA fee provision. That'll take you to R36, where Section 57 prohibits PCA from enforcing unadopted rules, much like the provision you saw earlier for DNR does. Section 58 is the first of two provisions that modify the Minnesota Environmental Rights Act to prohibit its use to challenge the water appropriations permits that are blessed by the other White Bear Lake sections. So that's Section 58 on R36 and 59 on R37. Also on R37, Section 60 is where it begins, but the change is on R38. This requires EAW petitioners to reside in the county where a proposed action will occur or in an adjoining county. And there's also a change in that same section on page R40 that would provide that a mandatory EAW is not required for projects affecting waters that are not in the public waters inventory. It would still allow a discretionary EAW or a petition-based EAW. Section 61 creates an account to promote special events in the state. And that carries through to R41, which the first section there is Senate Section 62, House Section 73, and Senate Section 63 and House Section 74. These are both identical, and they modify the school trust lands director statute various ways. R43, Section 64 on the Senate side and 76 on the House side are identical, and this allows counties to use the proceeds from tax forfeited land sales to clean up blighted tax forfeited land. Section 65 on the Senate side on R44 and Section 77 on the House side, also beginning on R44, are different. And to see the change, you have to go to R45, where on the House side, line 79.3, you'll see that the House is proposing to increase from 72.43 to 97% the portion of lottery and lieu money that goes to the Heritage Enhancement Account and the Natural Resources Fund. And then to see the Senate proposal, which is different, you have to turn the page to R46. At the bottom of that page, you'll see that the Senate's proposing to place 1% of the money from the lottery and lieu that currently goes to the general fund in the new events promotion account that is being created by Section 61. And just to be clear, this is general fund, this is from the general fund portion of the lottery and lieu proceeds, not from the other portion. Moving to R47 on Senate Section 66, this extends from 2019 to 2025, the date by which PCA has to complete wild rice water quality standards rulemaking. The bottom of R47, Section 67, this is also related to White Bear Lake, and it prohibits reducing water appropriations near the lake until the rulemaking has been undertaken. On R48, Senate Section 68, this allows DNR to give preference to a software vendor that currently provides vehicle registration software when it issues an RFP to replace its vehicle registration system. At the bottom of that page, Section 69, this requires DNR and stakeholders to explore options for supplying the East Metro communities with drinking water in a sustainable and growth-supporting way. This is also related to White Bear Lake. Turning to R49, Section 70 requires DNR to issue permits and convey any interests that are required to ensure traveler safety on County State Aid Highway 13. The bottom of R49, Section 71, requires PCA to fill certain vacancies in its air permitting program. On R50, Section 72, this imposes interim provisions related to whole effluent toxicity that'll be in place until PCA rulemaking is complete, which is required by a subsequent section I'll get to in a minute. Section 73 on R51 is part of the DNR's snowmobile decal changes, just providing for a transition while those changes are put into place. Section 74 on the Senate side on R51 and Section 84 on the House side are different. The Senate section requires, includes provisions related to the snowmobile decal changes that are part of the DNR policy request. The House section does not include those because it does not include those sections from the DNR policy bill. Both the House and Senate section include provisions related to rulemaking in response to some changes made in earlier sections related to WMA access. So they're the same in that respect. They just differ in the presence or absence of the snowmobile decal rulemaking changes. The bottom of R51, Section 75, this requires PCA to seek EPA approval to not apply ambient air quality standards to permits where the permit is being issued solely to continue operations at existing emissions levels. Turning to R52, Section 76, this one goes along with Section 72, and this requires PCA to expand whole effluent toxicity provisions that currently apply in the Lake Superior Basin to sugar beet processors in the rest of the state. On that same page, Section 77 would provide that PCA can't require Pfas monitoring unless it covers the costs, and there are exceptions for certain things such as previously authorized or already in place monitoring. The bottom of that page, Section 78, requires the Red River Basin Commission to develop a feasibility assessment of adaptive phosphorus management on the Red River. Then turning to R53, Section 79 on the Senate side authorizes expansion of a structure in the West Newton Special Use District. And then Section 80 at the bottom of that page on the Senate side and Section 96 on the House side are different. The Senate section repeals language in connection with the minnow provisions that I went over earlier, as well as the DNR snowmobile changes and the APR, the ban on new APR. And Mr. Chair, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Taylor at this point to continue.
Ms. Taylor.
Mr. Chair and members, I'm going to start on the bottom of R53, the House Repealer, Section 96. Paragraph A would contain some repealers related to turtle seller's license and turtle trapping. There's the House language will eliminate the turtle seller's license. Paragraph B would repeal some provisions that will be replaced with new lead and cadmium provisions that were proposed by the governor that will appear later on in the bill.
Excuse me, Ms. Taylor, I think you have to pull it forward.
Sure.
There you are. Thank you.
Paragraph C at the top of R54 repeals some language being replaced by some new watercraft operators permit requirements that the House is carrying. Section 1 would establish some salary limits for the director of a new Minnesota Outdoor Recreation Office that's created later on in the bill. Section 2 and 3 on the House side would allow a city to adopt an ordinance that bans the use of pollinator lethal insecticides. Section 4 on R55 would establish a definition for coated agricultural seed. Section 5 on the bottom of that page, moving on to R56, would prohibit the use or sale of seed that's treated with a neonic. Section 6 would require the Commissioner of Agriculture to develop guidance on the proper disposal of seeds that have been treated with a neonic. Section 7 would establish some statewide goals for protecting, restoring, and enhancing the state's peat soils. And then Section 8 on the bottom of R56 would prohibit the use of certain insecticides on state lands, such as WMAs and state parks, state forests, and scientific and natural areas. Section 9 on the bottom of that page, continuing on to R57, would require the DNR to update its invasive species management plan by certain dates, and then require the plan to address the impacts of climate change on invasive species management. Section 11 is the first of several sections that increase the maximum per diem rate that members of certain councils, commissions, and boards would be able to be compensated with, and this section is for the Minnesota Zoological Board. Moving on to R58, Section 12 would create the new Minnesota Outdoor Recreation Office with purposes and duties that are similar to the recommendations from the Minnesota Outdoor Recreation Task Force. This is a longer section, so we can skip ahead to R60. On the bottom of that page is Section 13, and then Section 13 through 18 are all provisions that would establish the new watercraft operator permit requirements, and that would be applicable to those that are 12 years of age and older, and that they would be phased in. Section 13 has the definitions. Sections 14 and 15, moving to page R62, would establish those requirements. Section 15 on R62 also establishes those requirements, and then 16 on R63 would require the DNR to establish some watercraft safety course and testing program, as well as a boater safety examination that would be administered by motorboat rental businesses. Section 17 on R63 is the requirement for the motorboat rental businesses to administer that boater safety exam. And then moving to R64, Section 18 is just some conforming changes related to the watercraft operator's permit. Section 19 on the top of R65 is another provision that increases the per diem rate. This one is for the Minnesota Forest Resources Council. Section 21 would establish a definition of native swan, and that would mean trumpeter and tundra swans. And this would be applicable to the game and fish statutes. Section 25 would remove the fee for the turtle seller's license that's eliminated in the bill. Section 27 would require the use of non-toxic shot when hunting small game on WMAs in the farmland zone, and it defines that zone. Section 28 on the bottom of R65 would establish new gross misdemeanor for certain violations of the game and fish laws that pertain to native swans. Moving to R66, Section 29 would require a recreational turtle license in order to take turtles, and it also states that turtles that are taken from the wild are for personal use and may not be resold. Section 30 would modify turtle licensing exemptions and make some conforming changes. And 31 and 32 would also make some conforming changes related to the elimination of the turtle seller's license. Section 33 on the bottom of R67 is another section that's increasing the per diem rates. This one is for the Board of Water and Soil Resources. Moving to page R68, section 34 is a provision that would allow Bowser to use its easement stewardship accounts for repairing and replacing structures. It would also allow the board to use additional funds beyond statutory limits in emergency cases for emergency repairs and replacements of water control structures. Moving to R70, section 35 would statutorily create the Lawns to Legumes program that's receiving some additional funding in the House side. Section 36 would establish some soil health goals for the state. Section 37 would require Bowser to establish and maintain a drainage registry information portal with information on drainage proceedings and related information. Moving to R71, section 38 would establish a soil health cost share program administered by Bowser. Moving to R72, section 39 and also 40 are one of many sections from the DNR's proposal to provide some enhanced authority to enforce the state's water laws. Section 39 would add some additional authorities and duties. Section 40 would establish a duty of candor. Section 41 on R73 would require public meeting before issuing large water use permits. This is unrelated to the enforcement proposal by the DNR. This is a House proposal. Sections 43 and 44 are more provisions from the water law enforcement proposal. 43 would expand APO authority, and section 44 would increase the maximum penalty amount to $40,000. Moving to R74, section 45, this would require penalties to be forgiven if they're corrected, except for repeat or serious violations. Section 46 is another section from the enforcement, enhanced enforcement of water laws. This would allow for cumulative penalties. Section 47 is another enforcement section. This would provide some additional authorities to the DNR. And then moving to R77, section 48 on the bottom of that page. This is a PCA proposal from last year that would require the notice of certain pollutant discharges. The language has been modified since it was proposed originally from last year. On page R78, section 49 would require the PCA to hold public meetings prior to finalizing settlements greater than $25,000. On the bottom of that page, section 50 would establish a new multifamily building composting grant program to be administered by the PCA. And then we can skip ahead to R80, section 51. This would establish a new zero waste grant program to be administered by the PCA. And then we can skip to R83, section 52. This would prohibit certain methods for disposing treated seed that has been treated with neonicotinoids. Section 53 is a provision from the governor's budget proposal. It would establish a new account that the agency could use to cover the administrative costs of their voluntary investigative and cleanup program. Moving to R84, section 54. This would change the date the PCA has to submit private well testing results in the East Metro from January to February. Section 56 on R85 is a technical provision related to some new environmental justice sections the House is proposing. Section 57 would add a definition of commissioner to Chapter 116. Sections 58 and 59 would establish a definition of environmental justice and environmental justice area for purposes of some new provisions the House is proposing. Sections 60 through 62 would establish definitions of microplastic, nanoplastic, and plastic in Chapter 116. Section 63 on the bottom of R86 would require air permit holders to annually report air toxic emissions. Section 64 on R87 would require cumulative impact and demographic analysis before issuing or renewing permits that impact environmental justice areas. And then moving to Section 65 on R89, this would specify the contents of those demographic analysis required. Then moving to R90, Section 66, this would require the PCA to determine whether approving a permit would cause or contribute to increased environmental or health impacts in an environmental justice area, and then if so, they would need to deny or place conditions on the permit. Section 67 and R91 would require feedlots with a capacity of 1,000 or more animal units to have a financial assurance that meets certain requirements. Section 68 on the bottom of R91 would require the PCA to annually compile a list of abandoned manure storage areas. Moving to R92, Section 69, this would require the PCA to determine the boundaries of environmental justice areas. Section 70 is another section that increases per diem rates. This one would be for the EQB. Section 71 on the bottom of the page would require an EIS or an EAW with emissions that impact an environmental justice area to have a demographic analysis. Section 72 on R93 is another section increasing per diem rates. This is for the citizen members of the LCCMR. Moving on to R94, Section 75. This is a requirement of the Department of Public Safety to maintain watercraft operator permit information and then include that information on driver's license and ID cards. Section 78 is from the governor's budget proposal. This would expand the bans on consumer products that contain lead and cadmium. And then at the bottom of R95, Section 979 would allow a county to allow the expansion or impose some regulations on non-conforming structures. This is similar to language allowed for municipalities. Sections 80, 81, 82, and 83 would establish some definitions related to lead service lines in Chapter 473. And then on the bottom of R96, Section 85 would establish a community air monitoring system pilot grant program in the Minneapolis. Then moving to R99, Section 86 would require the PCA to initiate some rulemaking to regulate air toxic emissions. Moving to R101, Section 87, this would establish the Pig's Eye Area Task Force, and they would be tasked with coordinating efforts to clean up the Pig's Eye landfill site, as well as provide recommendations. Section 88 on R102 would prohibit the renewal or transfer of turtle cellar licenses. Section 89 would require the PCA to adopt some rules for the safe disposal of seeds treated with neonics. And then Section 90 on the top of R103 would allow the DNR to designate swan resting areas in the state swan migration corridor. And then in those designated sites, the use of lead sinkers would be prohibited. This is a pilot program that would expire January 1st, 2026. On the bottom of R103 is Section 91. This would require the DNR to increase the restitution values for tundra and trumpeter swans. On R104, Section 92, this would allow the PCA to phase in the new feedlot financial assurance requirements established in the bill. Section 93 would require the PCA and delegated counties to report lists of abandoned manure storage areas, and then requires the PCA to submit the lists and recommendations to the legislature. On the bottom of R104, Section 94, continuing on to R105, would require the PCA to take certain actions that were recommended by the legislative auditor in their petroleum tank release program report, and then report back to the legislature. Section 95 on the bottom of R105 would require the PCA to develop a plan for a carpet stewardship program. And then that would take us to Article 3, which starts on the bottom of R106. Article 3 pertains to farm survey and chronic wasting disease. Section 1 would make location data for survey farms public. Section 2 does a number of things. It would require immediate notification of escaped farm survey if they're not returned within 24 hours. It would also allow licensed hunters to kill and possess an escaped cervidae, and then requires those that are killed to be tested for CWD at the owner's expense. It would also state that owners are liable for the costs associated with escaped cervidae. On Section 3, on the top of R108, would require fencing to prevent physical contact between farm cervidae. It would also require repairs of fencing to be done within 14 days. Section 4 would require double fencing for farmed white-tailed deer. And then Section 5 would require farmed white-tailed deer to be identified with certain information within 14 days of birth. Section 6 on R109 would prohibit new white-tailed deer farm registrations, but it does allow for certain sales or transfers to family members one time. Section 7 would prohibit a person from moving farmed white-tailed deer to another location. And then if you move to R110, it also adds a number of new requirements of owners and land when there's been a CWD infection, including requiring cooperation, requiring depopulation within 30 days. It also requires fencing to be maintained for 10 years and then would prohibit raising cervidae on property for 10 years. There's also some property transfer and county recording requirements. And then it does state that an owner is responsible for the proper disposal of animals. Section 8 would modify cervidae importation restrictions. Section 9 would require farmed white-tailed deer to be live tested for CWD by December 31st, 2022. And then sections 10 and 11 would transfer the oversight of farm cervidae from the Board of Animal Health to the DNR. And that takes us to R112, which starts Article 4. These are a number of provisions related to PFAS. Sections 1 through 5 would ban the manufacture and sale of various consumer products that contain PFAS effective January 1st, 2025. Section 1 would do so for carpets, textiles, and related products. Section 2 would do that for cookware on the bottom of R113. Section 3 would do that for cosmetics. Moving to R114, Section 4 would do it for juvenile products, and there's a definition of that. Section 5 would do so for ski wax. And then on the bottom of R115, Section 6, this would require manufacturers of products that contain intentionally added PFAS to notify the PCA, and then it establishes what those notification requirements are. And then that takes us to page R117, Section 7. This would establish standards for labeling certain food or beverage products that, whether or not they're compostable, there'd be standards for that. And then on the bottom of R119, Sections 8, and then continuing on to the next page, Section 9, these would ban the manufacture and use of Class B firefighting foam that contains PFAS. Section 10 on the bottom of R120 would require the PCA to adopt some water quality standards for 2 different PFAS. Section 11 would require the Department of Health to amend the health risk limit for PFOS. And then that would conclude Article 2. And then I can move ahead to Article 3 on the Senate side and Article 5 on the House side. This is basically the lands bill, and most of the provisions are identical. I'm not going to go through section by section, but I'm just going to point out the non-technical differences.
Members, collect your questions for when we're done with the, going through the side-by-side. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair and members, if you want to go to R6, that'd be the first difference I want to point out.
Otherwise, before that, everything's the same.
Correct, Mr.
Yep.
Chair. Yep, everything is identical until we get to the top of R6. You'll see it. There's some additional Senate language on Senate lines 79.6 and 79.7. This language would increase the maximum lease term for tax forfeited lands from 10 to 25 years, then increase the dollar amount threshold that's used to determine whether a public sale requirement is imposed from $12,000 to $50,000. And then again, everything's identical until we get to R1, or R12. You'll see there's a house only, section 10. This provision would allow the private sale of tax forfeited land in Beltrami County. And then everything is identical until we get to R16. You'll see a Senate only, section 15. This would allow DNR to convey certain surplus state property in Lake County to the city of Two Harbors. And then we can skip ahead to the last page of that article, R20. You'll see another house-only section. This one would allow the National Guard to exchange surplus state land with the city of Rosemont. And then that would conclude the policy walkthrough.
So members, before we move into the appropriations, do we have any questions on the policies? Either side. Senator Weber.
Mr. Chair, I do, but I think they're probably for the commissioner, one of the commissioners, so I'll wait till they're doing their testimony.
Okay, very good. And members, just understand they're going to be, as you notice on the agenda, they will be testifying at the end here, so you can certainly have your questions then for them if you have any. Any other questions? Okay, then we'll move on to Article number 1, appropriations. We'll start out with, I believe we're going to start out with Mr. Mueller. I know he's been bouncing between two committees right now, but he's ready to go.
Mr. Chairman, my name is Dan Mueller. I'm the fiscal analyst on the Environment Committee. Mr. Brad Hagemeyer from the House and I will walk through the spreadsheet. Let me see. Yeah, and I think Mr. Hagemeyer is going to start off dealing with the House positions with PCA, and then I'll jump in and we'll kind of go back and forth.
Okay, I understand that. That's page R1, Article 1.
Mr. Chairman, we'll be working off the side-by-side spreadsheet that Mr. Hagemeyer is showing on the screen. The spreadsheet is just, I believe it's about a 6-page spreadsheet that just shows the change items on both bills. So we'll just be walking through the spreadsheet right now.
Sure, okay.
Mr. Chair, I'll take over if you don't mind.
Yes, go ahead.
I believe everyone can see the spreadsheet on the screen being shared right now. Just how the spreadsheet is set up, you'll see the first 2 columns here are the governor's revised recommendations. They're collapsed for biennial total. The next set of columns here is the Senate provisions for the current biennium. And then this set of columns in the middle will be the Senate provisions for the tails. And then on the right side, you'll see the House provisions for the current biennium, the change from the Senate, and then the House provisions for the tails and the change from the Senate again. I believe we'll just switch agency by agency here, and I'm not, if the House or Senate isn't carrying the governor's provision, I won't necessarily explain all of those. The first provision you'll see here on the House side is the Adaptation Action Grants and Water Storage. The House is carrying $10 million for this program. That's a reduced amount from what the governor had proposed, and there's a little bit of money in the tails for that as well. Sure. On line 4 is the agency operating increase. This is just a small general fund piece of $38,000 per year. When we get to the environmental fund and remediation fund, you'll see operating increases there as well. On line 5 is creating a community-based brownfield grant program for $1 million. This was a governor's recommendation that the House is carrying. On line 7 is the Pfas community grants. This was a governor's recommendation and the House is carrying it at $2 million. On line 10 is the waste prevention recycling grants and loans. The House is carrying this at $10 million. The governor had just under $19 million for it. On line 11, you'll see the St. Louis River Mercury TMDL availability extension. The governor proposed this the House and Senate both dealt with it differently. The House is canceling it, reappropriating it to comply with the budget rules. I believe the Senate is just extending it for a shorter period of time also to comply with the budget rules. On line 12, 13, and 14, you'll see provisions related to the Pig's Eye landfill. That was $1.8 million, $800,000 of which is for the task force, and $1 million is for the preliminary cleanup assessment. On line 15, you'll see $50,000 for the petroleum tank release cleanup report. On line 16 is the feedlot permit financial assistance and inventory for $250,000 per year from the general fund. You'll also see a appropriation for the same amount in the environmental fund when I get to that point. Line 17 is county grants for abandoned feedlot and manure storage reports, and this was $700,000 one time. On line 18 is the Minnesota Association of County Feedlot Officers training, and that'd be $250,000 one time. On line 19 is the multifamily building composting pilot program for $5 million. On line 20, you'll see environmental justice. There's a few pieces of this. This came from Representative Lee at House File 3146. This one was fully funded between the general fund and the environmental fund. You'll see it's $9,080,000 in the first year. And then when I get to the environmental fund, I'll explain how much is being appropriated in the tails, and there's revenue as well. On line 21, there's a statewide air quality monitoring program for $5 million. On line 22 is air monitoring equipment purchase of $540,000. On line 23 is air monitoring community grants for $500,000. And on line 24 is air emissions rulemaking for $500,000 one time. On line 25 is $1 million per year for the Get the Lead Out program at the Pollution Control Agency. On line 26 and 27 is seed disposal rulemaking and enforcement. There's $175,000 for the rulemaking and $100,000 per year for the disposal enforcement. On line 28 are micro and nanoplastics testing and protocols for $2 million. That's a one-time appropriation. And on line 29 is the zero waste provisions, and that'd be $1.5 million one time. In total, the House appropriated $51.533 million in FY23, and then $3,042,000 in the tails from the general fund to the Pollution Control Agency. Skipping down, we get to the environmental fund. The first change again was the agency operating increase. This was the governor's proposal. It's $4.167 million per year. On line 33 is increasing capital assistance program for grants to local governments. Again, this was a governor's proposal for $17,000. On line 34 is the restrict cadmium and lead in certain consumer products for $74,000 per year. Again, that was the governor's recommendation the House is carrying. On line 36 is $150,000 one time for a carpet product stewardship report. On line 37 is rules adoption for Pfas water quality standards, and it's $452,000. On line 38 and 39 is the appropriation, but it's in the tail, so it sets a base from the environmental fund for the Pfas requirements for the various products that Ms. Taylor listed that are included in the House bill. On line 40 is the disclosure of Pfas in certain products. That's $314,000 the first year, $300,000, then $154 in the tails. On line 41 is a public hearing requirement for alleged violations, and this is $48,000 per year. Skipping to the next page, the first one you'll see is the feedlot permit financial assistance inventory, and that was $250,000 per year from the environmental fund, and that's on top of the $250,000 from the general fund. On line 43 is the environmental justice again. The general fund piece was $9,080,000. In FY24, it switches to the environmental fund of $8.979 million. And then in FY25, it's $8.6 million. Through the rulemaking process, the fees get set. So you'll also see down on line 65, the revenue of $8.63 million. So starting in FY25, the revenues and the appropriation offset for this program. That is all the changes from the environmental fund for the House, and in total it's $5.472 million in FY23 and $28.6 million in the tails. And you'll see here the Senate has some changes, but I'll wait till I get done with the Pollution Control Agency and Mr. Mueller can go through the Senate side. On line 52, 53, and 54, you'll see the remediation fund changes. The operating increase again is $543,000 from the remediation fund. And then on line 54, you'll see the petroleum tank release cleanup operating increase, which actually just gets transferred into the remediation fund and spent out of there. So those two pieces are operating increase. And then you'll see $133,000 per year for railroad safety. In total, there's $1.53 million per year from the remediation fund. On line 59, you'll see $90,000 of statutory spending out of the special revenue fund, and this was a new account created at the Pollution Control Agency for administering the brownfield program. In total, there's $58.625 million of appropriations in FY23 to the Pollution Control Agency on the House side, and almost $35 million in the tails. On line 63, you'll see the revenue changes. The first one that the House has is line 65. Again, that's a revenue starting in 25 for the environmental justice provisions. On line 66, there's the 3M reporting changes. This was an agency recommendation. It just has a savings of $1,000. On line 68 and 69, you'll see the revenue changes related to the new brownfield program account. And then again, on line 70, the operating increase is a transfer in from the Petro fund to the remediation fund. And then on line 71, again, that's the St. Louis for Mercury TMDL extension, which I showed in the appropriations, but in order to comply with the budget rules, it's also canceled first and then reappropriated. And Mr. Chair, that is all the changes on the House side for the Pollution Control Agency. I'll let Mr. Mueller explain the Senate side.
Thank you. Mr. Mueller.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I'll be working off the Senate columns that Mr. Hagemeyer showed, dealing with the Pollution Control Agency. The Senate did not have any appropriations or changes to the general fund in the general fund, so there's no change there. So we'll jump ahead to line 44 within the environmental fund. The Senate has a one-time $86,000 appropriation for Lake Township wastewater system design. The next item is $700,000 in addition to the base for the SCORE grants. Currently, there's about $18.45 million going out for SCORE grants. This would add $700,000 to that base and continue it on in the tails. The next item is $671,000 for whole effluent toxicity rulemaking. There's some policy sections that Mr. Stanley pointed out in the policy article that tied to this. So this would pay for the rulemaking. The next item is $50,000 from the environmental fund for an air permit study that would ask the PCA to look at how the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency is handling the air permitting system within Region 5 of the EPA region, compare that to the other states. The next item is $250,000 for the Red River Basin phosphorus management. Again, there's a section in the policy article for this. The last item under environmental fund is $740,000. This would go to the Environmental Quality Board to have them sort of do the final part of the Section 404 permitting. And previously, a couple years ago, we had an appropriation that also went to the EQB to sort of do the front end of this. And this would sort of do the back end of it and have the state of Minnesota apply to get a permit or a waiver for the Section 404 permits. So the Senate spends $2.497 million from the environmental fund in 23, and then $700,000 a year ongoing. Under the remediation fund, the Senate has one item. It's a $1.5 million appropriation to demolish the Williams School in the Lake of the Woods County. This is a school that has been tax forfeited and is now the land and the school building is state owned and has been unoccupied for school reasons since I believe 1973. So there's a request here to demolish the school, and it has some the reason remediation fund is the school has some petroleum, has been noted to have some petroleum leftover and asbestos. So the total PCA changes for the Senate is $3.997 million fiscal year 23 using just the environmental fund and remediation fund. And then $700,000 a year ongoing. Those are with the SCORE grants. The Senate also has the 3M reporting changes that Mr. Hagemeyer noted, and that was in the governor's request. That just saves $1,000 per year, and that's on line 66. So that is it for the PCA. I will now move down to start off the Senate changes with the Department of Natural Resources. So we'll jump ahead on the spreadsheet. The Senate did not have any general fund changes with the Department of Natural Resources. So we have no changes on the total on line 105. The House had 52.96 million, and Mr. Hagemeyer will go through those after I go through the Senate items. Under Game and Fish, the Senate had 3 items, and they're all appropriations from the Heritage Enhancement account. We had $150,000 one-time for shooting sports facility grants. This is an additional amount. There's currently a $250,000 base amount. This adds to there was a current first year appropriation for this, and then this adds a second year. The next item is Calcareous Fan Monitoring. There's some policy that Mr. Stanley pointed out in the policy bill dealing with calcareous fens, and this would appropriate $387,000 ongoing from the Heritage Enhancement account to monitor the calcareous fens. And then the last item the Senate has from the Game and Fish Fund is $496,000 to do the study that is tied to the White Bear Lake water levels provisions in the policy part of the bill. Next, we'll go to the Natural Resources Fund changes in the bill. Both the House and the Senate have the Voyager County ATV Trail $500,000 appropriation, and also the Prospector Trail $500,000 appropriation. These two come from the ATV account in the Natural Resources Fund. The Senate also has another appropriation of $447,000 for the Roseau ATV Trail resurfacing. And then the Senate carries $40,000 per year ongoing from the off-road highway vehicle account to start up an ambassador program out of that account, and that would have a $40,000 a year ongoing cost. So the total amount through the Game and Fish Fund and the Natural Resources Fund on the Senate side is $2.52 million. And then I'll also note the one revenue change the Senate has dealing with DNR is, and this is also in the House, and it was also came from the governor. It's we count a certain amount of revenue due to the lands bill, and this goes in the land acquisition account. So that is $1.616 million, and again, that's the same in both the House and the Senate. And now I'll go back to Mr. Hagemeyer, who can explain the House provisions.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I will start back up on page 2, line 74 is the Department of Natural Resources. The first change the House had was the climate adaptation for natural lands and waters. The House is carrying $25 million for this purpose and has carve-outs of $10 million for public water access sites, $10 million for fish hatchery improvements, and $5 million for native plant restoration at state parks. The next change the House has is the ensure aggregate mapping for local governments. There's $300,000 the first year, and then $100,000 per year ongoing for that purpose. Skipping down to line 88, you'll see restoring grasslands and wetlands and WMAs for carbon capture and storage. That House is carrying this at $5 million. On line 89, there's $250,000 for rough fish report. On line 90 is the Minnesota Swan Protection Act, and this would be used to designate those swan resting areas. And that's 1.4 million. On line 91 is groundwater storage funding of $421,000. On line 92, there's $30,000 for walleye stocking on the Rat Root River. On line 93 is 1.841 million for AIS grants. On line 94, you'll see farm survey requirements. There's no appropriation in 23, but this funds the fiscal note for some of the provisions starting in 25. It sets the base. It increases the base by 1.383 million. On line 95 is SNA maintenance funding of $3.3 million. On line 96 is ash tree replacement grants for $10,150,000. On line 97, there's $1 million for school tree planting grants. On line 98 is water use public meeting requirements, and this would be $1 million the first year and $250,000 ongoing. On line 99, there's $1 million for the elk reintroduction. On line 100 is $250,000 one time for the DNR to have an RFP for the RT quick testing. On line 101, there's $500,000 one time for chronic waste and disease response in the Grand Rapids area. On line 102 is $600,000 the first year and $300,000 per year ongoing for the No Child Left Inside grant program. On line 103 is a Conistillo mine pit infrastructure operation and maintenance funding. This would just be for the OMF operation and maintenance. It doesn't pay for the actual structure, but it's $850,000 one time and it's available for a while. On line 104 is $70,000 per year for the non-game wildlife program. In total, the House appropriates $52.962 million from the general fund to the DNR. And then you'll see the tails are $2.8 million. Skipping down to line 107 is the Game and Fish Fund. The only change the House had is $15,000 for signage related to the banning of non-toxic shot on certain WMAs. On line 113 is the start of the Natural Resources Fund, and Mr. Mueller explained the two trails that the House included. And then you'll see on line 117, the House also included $750,000 one time from the State Parks and Trails Lottery in lieu account. So in total, for all the funding sources is $54.727 million to the DNR, and the tails are $2.8 million. The revenue changes, the first one, there's a little bit of lost revenue related to the turtle taking provisions included in the House language. And then Mr. Mueller explained the lands bill. On line 124 through 130, you'll see revenue changes. They're all related to the lottery in lieu allocation change. I listed them here under the DNR. Not all of them are necessarily the DNR, but they're in the Natural Resources Fund, so I'm showing the revenue changes here. The House increased the allocation to 97%. That has a general fund cost of $11.85 million in the first year and then $12.2 million each year thereafter. And then you'll see on lines 125, 126, 127, 128, 129, the amount of revenue that would go into each of those accounts under the current funding formula. The Senate, you included a provision to create a new events promotion account. You'll see the revenue changes here for that as well. The general fund cost for that one, for the 1%, and then the amount of money, the $470,000 going into the promotions account. That is all there is for the DNR. I'll continue on with the border water and soil resources. On line 134, the House included $10 million one time and a little bit of ongoing money for adaptation action grants and water storage. On line 135, the House is carrying the governor's request for $595,000 for the COVID unreimbursed costs. On line 136, there's $5 million for the Healthy Soil Program. On line 137, there's $125,000 the first year and slightly increasing amount each year in the tails for the support for a tribal liaison. On line 138, there's $10 million one time for a CRP state incentive. On line 139, there's $5 million the first year and $1.25 million each year thereafter for the Lawns to Legumes program. On line 140, there's $200,000 for a drainage registry. On line 141, there's $30 million one time for the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program. On line 142 and 143, there's $8 million for the conservation tree planting, and then there's a carve out of $500,000 for invasive species management within that appropriation. In total, the House appropriates $68.92 million in FY23 to the Board of Water and Soil Resources, and in the tails, it's just over $3.096 million. The Senate did not include any fiscal changes for the Board of Water and Soil Resources. So I'll continue down to line 146 is the Conservation Corps of Minnesota. There's an operating increase of $500,000 the first year and $250,000 per year ongoing out of the general fund. And that's the only change for the Conservation Corps. On line 150 is the start of the Metropolitan Council Parks and Water provisions. The mapping infrastructure, climate risk, and resiliency opportunities. This is a governor's recommendation. The House is carrying at $2.5 million. On line 152 and 153, you'll see $2.5 million for inflow and infiltration work on publicly owned service lines, and then additional $2.5 million for privately owned lines. On line 154, you'll see lead service line replacement grants of $2.335 million one time. And on line 155, there's a general fund increase of $2.5 million one time for the parks within the Metropolitan Council. In total, there's $12.335 million from the general fund, all one time being appropriated to the Metropolitan Council. On line 158, you also see a $750,000 appropriation out of the lottery in lieu account for the Metropolitan Council parks. In total, just over $13 million is being appropriated to that council. On line 162, you'll see the Zoological Board. There's a base adjustment in FY24 of $45,000 for prairie butterfly conservation. Going to the next page on line 166 is the Science Museum. There's a one-time increase in FY23 of $500,000 from the general fund. On line 170 is Explore Minnesota Tourism. On line 171, the governor had recommended additional administrative capacity funding of $215,000 per year. The House includes this provision. And then line 173, you'll see the House has $10 million for tourism recovery grants, and that's one time. And then there's $250,000 for a grant to the Grand Portage Band for tourism. In total, the House appropriates $10,465,000 from the general fund for Explore Minnesota Tourism. And I see I have a typo here. This should be from Explore Minnesota Tourism. And I think Mr. Mueller can explain the changes for the Senate side on tourism.
Mr. Mueller.
Sure, thank you. Mr. Chairman and members, the items of the Senate is changing here at the Board of Tourism. These are the only general fund changes the Senate has in the bill. The Senate appropriates $1 million one time for a large-scale events promotion proposal. Then tying back to the lottery in lieu revenue changes that Mr. Hagemeyer briefly talked about, and that Mr. Stanley talked about in the policy part of the bill, the Senate creates a new fund, a new account in the Natural Resources Fund, and takes 1% of the lottery in lieu money that is currently going to the general fund and deposits it into a new events promotion account. So, and then this bill appropriates $450,000 out of that new account per year to do large-scale events promotions, and it would require that the money be split in promotions from half of it going to the metro area and half of it going to the outstate areas. Again, so there's the cost of the general fund portion to the bill is the $1 million of one-time spending, and then the $470,000 per year that's going to the events promotion account. So that's it for the Senate side.
Mr. Chair, continuing on line 180, you saw in the policy language, the House had the creation of the Minnesota Outdoor Recreation Office. The bill provides $1.75 million the first year and $250,000 per year ongoing for that purpose. On line 185 is the U of M. There's on line 186 is the Soil Health Action Plan. It's $180,000 one time from the general fund. On line 189, you'll see the MLCAT repayment. There's a one-time repayment of $29,055,000 into that fund from the transfers that happened in the early 2000s. And that was an estimate provided by the Pollution Control Agency for that number. In total, you'll see the general fund appropriations of $228,200,000. And then you'll see the revenue changes as well, including the lost general fund revenue. The House has a net general fund for this bill of $240 million. And then on line 199, you'll see the other funds of expenditure of $9.6 million. So $249,600,000 is the FY23 appropriations included in the House bill. And then you'll see in the tails, the net general fund was $35 million for the House provisions. And then the other funds was $31.88 million. So total tails appropriation would be $66.88 million. And I can say the totals. On the Senate side, you'll see a line 193, you had the $1 million general fund appropriation for the Senate side, the lost general fund revenue of $470,000 that goes into that new account. Total net general fund for the Senate was $1.47 million in the current biennium, $980,000 in the tails. The other funds appropriation of just under $7 million and then $3.1 million in the tails. And that is all I have on the spreadsheet, Mr. Chair.
Well, thank the both of you. That was a lot of work. We appreciate that. I know there's going to be some questions here, members. You'll notice the Senate column is quite scant, to say the least, it being a non-budget year, and that's kind of the philosophical view that we took moving forward. Not so much I see in the House. If I could ask, really, what's the difference? I think it should be noted here, and it's right in front of us, but we're about, and Mr. Mueller, maybe you can answer this, as far as net general fund change when it comes to general funding. What's the difference? I mean, we're 230 million off. Does that sound right?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and members, if you look at line number 197 on the spreadsheet, in fiscal year, the House has a net spending or net general fund of $240 million. The Senate's 1.47 million. So the difference between, you can see in that change from Senate column is $238.5 million in fiscal year 23. And then about a little over $34 million in the tails, the difference between the House and the Senate.
Okay.
On the general fund.
Thank you very much. Members, as you can see, we've got a ways to go here when it comes to financing. I'm wondering if there's anybody that has any other questions with regards to any questions for the presenters so far. Ms. Wozlik, Representative Wozlik.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not familiar with the, so the $1 million that's going towards Minnesota sports and events. I don't see any, unless I missed it, I didn't see any language in the policy section beyond what's in the appropriation section. Is there a way that they're going to, that organization is going to decide what they spend the money on? Because I think it's sports and events is a very broad sort of field. And so I'm just wondering if you have any sense, I don't know if you worked on that provision or someone else, but of sort of what criteria they have, if they get funding now, what they do with it, or how they figure out what sort of events and things would actually get that money.
Yeah, thank you for that question, because it is a new line. And Mr. Stanley, I wonder if you could help us out with the description of the bill.
Mr. Chair, members, I think what you're asking about is Senate Section 61, which is on the Article 2 side-by-side, page R40 at the bottom. And that is the language that actually creates the events promotion account. Representative Wozlik, is that what you're asking about?
Representative Wozlik.
Yes, I think that's what I'm asking about. I'm looking at the language right now. So this part creates an account, but then there's in the appropriations language, that appropriation, from my reading of it, goes to a specific organization. And so I'm just sort of confused about what what's actually happening with that language and where that money is going.
So, Mr. Chair,
Mr. Stanley.
it sounds like you're asking about language in Article 1. If that's the case, I would suggest you ask Mr. Mueller that question.
Mr. Mueller, can you help us out?
Sure, Mr. Chairman and Representative Walls, there is a appropriation language. It's on page R17 in Article 1 of the side-by-side. Yes, it is a one-time $1 million general fund appropriation, and it would be a grant to the Minnesota Sports and Events organization for them to promote large-scale sporting and other events to the state. This organization is a organization that works to bring some of the bigger events into the Minnesota, like, the Final Four and things like that. So this would give them some one-time money to do some more promotions and events, trying to get more of these events into the state of Minnesota. This was a bill that was carried by Senator Rosen and brought to our committee. So it's sort of the two-part proposal, the $1 million one-time general fund for them to do, that would go directly to this organization. And then the ongoing money out of the new account isn't necessarily set up to this organization ongoing, but would be for the same purposes, for bringing events into Minnesota. And the other ongoing money would be split between metro and non-metro areas. This one-time money does not have that split.
Okay,
Representative
and
Wasserman.
just one follow-up, I guess, just a comment. I think the $1 million appropriation that's going to this specific organization seems like something that we can do, but I'm just concerned that if we're creating an events promotion account as a separate account in the Natural Resources Fund, that would be something that I would want to, we want to see that's actually about the environment and natural resources. So understanding that there's a lot of outdoor recreation enthusiasts in the state, and there are a lot of things that we do, but just understanding that that's going to be a separate account in the Natural Resources Fund, just wanting to make sure that that's actually related to sort of the environment and natural resources that we're talking about. So that's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. I would ask Mr. Mueller with regards to if this is the appropriate place for such a program versus any other place.
Mr. Chairman, the reason why we put the new account in the Natural Resources Fund is basically to keep it into the jurisdiction of the Environment and Natural Resources committees and their jurisdiction. And the other accounts that come from this lottery in lieu are also part of the Natural Resources Fund, or the other part of it goes into the Game and Fish Fund. So that's the reason why this account right now in the Senate bill is in the Natural Resources Fund, more for a jurisdictional issue. Really, the account could exist anywhere because the money is coming from the offset of the general fund, but the money could go into as an account into actually any fund that would be under the jurisdiction of this committee.
Might I add also, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Mueller, that the events that are brought into either rural or metro Minnesota, large events, there's a significant amount of spending that goes on from those that are here, that come here to visit our state, and I would think probably very significant, and a certain amount of that sales tax that is expended turns around and comes right back into the environment. So I'm not sure that we can come up with a figure on what that is, but it's going to be a very large amount, and it was kind of exciting to talk about doing something like this because we stand to make some more money that goes directly into the environment. So, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the line of logic on that is also why we put $10 million into local grants for tourism, because you put those dollars out in the communities, and as we're coming out of COVID, a number of the community festivals all across the state have suffered for not having attendance for a couple of years, or maybe limited attendance. And so jumpstarting tourism, not just with big events, not just for the big fish, but all the little fish that are out there who are trying to swim again, That's why we invested $10 million. And, you know, the $230 million difference, I think, is $230 million of opportunity because there is one-time money. We do have a budget surplus. And that budget surplus, particularly, I think, should be used to help our state heal as we come out of COVID. And so just like a big event, hundreds of little events where we can put money in for tourism are important. In addition, we have a lot of line items. You know, I know there's a lot of line items here and there's a lot of policy, but there's a reason for that. With that one-time money, we're trying to fix some past wrongs. And one of those was the Metropolitan Landfill Trust account where money was taken by the legislature during a general fund shortfall with the promise that it would be paid back. Now would be the time where we could pay that back. And Mr. Chair and other members, if you pay it back now, you don't have to listen to us talk about it year after year after year. As it keeps going on, it would be an opportunity to pay that back. In addition, around the same time, the lottery in lieu of, and you mentioned that for tourism, that was cut back from its original intent. So restoring that, that's where most of our tails money goes, is restoring that back to the way it was almost 20 years ago. And that money, we're not tinkering of where it goes. We keep the formula the same, but we're putting money into the program. Another big ticket item is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, one-time money to maximize some of the federal dollars that are there. We know that our soil and water conservation districts can make that program work. They can get the job done. So those are some of the big ticket items. But we have a lot of things in here, and we had hearings, we had bills, and that's what's in front of us. I know the gulf is kind of wide and deep between us on the amount of money. But like I said earlier, I think there are things that hopefully we can come together on, both on the money and on the policy. I know our agencies are eager to give us their thoughts, and so maybe if there aren't any other questions, Mr. Chair, we could go to them.
Yeah, any other questions, members? Representative Wosley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had one quick question. I think this would probably be better directed at Mr. Mueller. Perhaps there's some funding for PFAS-related items in the Senate bill, and I'm wondering if, I'm looking at the language that's not clear to me in those appropriations on page R26.1. It's not clear to me whether those appropriations could be used for the monitoring, for the PFAS monitoring plan. So I know the Senate bill requires the MPCA to pay for the PFAS monitoring of the facilities that it's moving forward with. And I'm just wondering if, I'm reading the language, I'm not seeing language there, but if any of that money could be used for those PFAS monitoring purposes, or if those PFAS appropriations are more specific to certain things and wouldn't be available to be used.
Mr. Mueller, can you handle that one?
Sure, Mr. Chairman and Representative Wozniak, I think you're looking at something that's in the, let's see here, page R26, did you say?
Yes, that's where the, I think it starts on R26 and goes to R28. So the last couple pages of the appropriations, Article 1. So that's what I'm looking at. I see the language there, but I don't know if that language that's tied to the appropriations would mean that some of that funding could be used for the PFAS monitoring, or if that's all just for such specific purposes that it would not be able to be used for the PFAS monitoring.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Wozniak, the language that's on the Senate side on page R26 and that's all from last year's budget bill. So we're not making any new changes or any new appropriations for PFAS. We just made one change and that's on page R27. That's where we made the appropriation for the St. Louis River TMDL available until June 23rd. So we didn't make any other changes to the existing PFAS appropriations on the Senate side. We pulled this section into the bill just to make that one change to the one appropriation, but otherwise we didn't make any changes regarding what the PCA could spend the PFAS money on. There is something in the policy part of the article that deals with whether, with the new PFAS plan that PCA has, about whether there's any, that whether any of the money has to go for monitoring at the local level. Mr. Stanley can talk about that, but that language on the Senate side is existing law.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
Representative Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Representative Hansen's point about COVID, I think during the pandemic, a lot of Minnesotans either rediscovered their love for the great outdoors or found first-time love for the great outdoors, which is wonderful. But one of the things that we've seen is a lot of new boats being purchased and being used on lakes all around our state. Which is great, but I wanted to make sure, did I see correctly that the watercraft operator permit, is that in the Senate bill as well as the House bill?
No, it's not. It's not in the Senate bill.
Okay. Because I do think there was a really interesting article in the Star Tribune this morning written by Tom Horner, who some of you may recall ran for governor at one point, about attracting, as we face our workforce shortages, attracting young people to come to Minnesota. And one of the great draws is our water. And we're in this moment where there are a lot of threats to our water. And I'm concerned that it seems like there's some relaxing of permitting around protecting our water on the Senate side. And I had two hopefully short questions, and I hope this is the appropriate time to ask about two provisions in the Senate bill. One is about the final part of the Section 404 permit study. Could someone just very briefly clarify what that provision is about?
Mr. Stanley, if you could help us out.
Or, Mr. Chairman, I can probably do that.
Mr. Mueller.
It's in the appropriation article on page R9. The Senate would appropriate $740,000 to the EQB to develop and assemble the material required under the Code of Federal Regulations to assume the Section 401 permitting. Like I mentioned earlier, the Senate had, both the House and the Senate had appropriated money to the EQB to do some front-end work on the Section 404 permitting. And the reason why the Senate has this appropriated to the EQB is Section 404 permitting affects the natural resources, PCA, and Bowser. And so we chose the EQB for this appropriation because the heads of those agencies are all part of the EQB.
Right.
So they must work on developing the material and what other changes must be made in state law and rules that would have the state assume the Section 404 permitting. And then it would require the state under the Board of Water and Soil Resources to make an application for the assumption of these permitting by June 30th, 2025.
Does that answer your question?
I think so, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And then just one other quick question, if I may.
Representative Morrison.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The air permit study to look at the way EPA Region 5 manages it, I'm hoping to understand where that's coming from and what it's about.
Mr. Mueller.
Mr. Chairman and members, this was a Senator Ingebrigtsen bill. This was a request by, to have the PCA look at the air permitting requirements within the state and how it differs from the other states that are part of the Region 5, in the Region 5 EPA area. And the language on page R2 outlines the things that they would want the PCA to look at, such as what funding sources are used and fees are used to fund the air permitting system, and how these fees and the cost of the permitting system have changed over the last 20 years. And like I said, you can see that the number of items that this study is supposed to look at is on page R2 and R3 of the appropriation bill. And like I said, this was a request that Senator Ingebrigtsen had in one of his policy bills.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator. Senator Weber?
I was just thinking about your question that you posed, Mr. Chairman. You know, with the disparity that exists in our two bills, how do we resolve that substantial of a difference, in your opinion?
Well, I think we'll be finding that out very quickly, actually. You know, everybody's got a definition of what to do with all the money, and it seems like the folks on the other side of the aisle look at this, not only here, but many other budgets, as an opportunity to spend probably more money than we should have collected. And that's the philosophical difference. So I'm not sure how we're going to come to a resolution here today. I suspect that there's going to be hopefully a lot of well, I'm not sure. You know, we don't have targets. We have not received targets. I don't expect we're going to receive anything more in the near future. At least I'm not hearing that from folks in our caucus and or the finance folks or leadership. So we're a long ways off. We really are. I see lots of spending here that I've never seen before, and this is not a budget year. Now that may sound like sound a little goofy to some people that we have all this money and we're not going to spend it, but there is a real difference as to what we should be doing with those dollars. If these programs that are here, that are put in by the House, that are literally millions of dollars worth of new spending, it would seem to me that would be a good place would be during a budget year, and this is not. So that's why you see us holding as strong as we have on it being a non-budget year. And, you know, there's things in here, you know, environmental justice for one. I look at that and I guess that's going to be one of my questions that I ask. Where does that come from? How do we go about defining that? And is that something that, you know, is something that's fairly new on the horizon? I know we've had discussions in the past about air quality monitoring, and we have, I think, agreed to do a lot of air quality monitoring in the state of Minnesota. However, I'm not sure where the environmental justice portion comes in. I don't think it's a real surprise that last year I would not allow, at least I didn't agree to any of that kind of language, and I would like to know where that's coming from. And if we're going to be dealing with this, you know, if you put it in statute, you put something like that in statute, it never goes away. And really and truly, what does it mean and how much money do we spend on that? That's just one area. With regards to tourism, I'm pretty excited about this new large thing, big events thing. I mean, I look for it to be a real plug for the state of Minnesota, as well as the environment, to reap some real benefits off of this. So I think it's a real good thing, and that's really basically the only thing we have. The only thing we have in this budget is that from general fund money. And so long question with a long answer. I'm not sure where we go. That'll be one of the questions that I ask the guy sitting to the right of me eventually here. And we'll be doing that, I think, real quickly. But